My favorite superhero has been, is, and probably always will be Spider-Man. Now, I'm not claiming to be an expert in all things Spider-Man, but I've absorbed a lot of different renditions of the character from over the years. I've seen all three movie franchises, although I will admit I am a bit rusty on the Andrew Garfield ones. When I was younger, my parents bought me several volumes of the Spider-Man Marvel Masterworks collection, so I am fairly familiar with Spidey's 60s roots. And though I am generally less familiar with the newer stuff, I have still read several issues from basically every decade of Spider-Man. I mean, there's still like tens of thousands of issues and arcs that I probably haven't read, but because I'm a nerd, and especially because I'm a girl, I have to establish my like nerd street cred when I start off the video. So just understand, folks, without a doubt, I am definitely a true believer in this regard. I've always liked superheroes in general, mostly because my dad and brother were into them, and you inherit your family's interests, but the one who always stuck out to me the most was Spider-Man, and I think a large part of that is due to Spider-Man the Animated Series. Right around when Disney bought Marvel, there was a few months where on Disney XD at like 2 in the morning, they would air reruns of old Marvel cartoons. I don't know why. But one night, by happenstance, my dad was flicking through the TV guide, and he happened to stumble across these episodes and record them because he thought I would like them. And to this day, he probably has no idea how much that decision influenced my love of superheroes in specific and my tastes in narrative and storytelling in general. I watched the X-Men animated series and basically only liked it for the theme song. I watched one of the Hulk cartoons. I don't remember if it was the one from the 80s or the 90s. I watched that terrible Iron Man cartoon, and I watched the Fantastic Four show where they replaced the Human Torch with Herbie, because apparently back then they thought that Herbie was cool. I watched Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, but I swear to you the only episode that I remember is the Swarm one, because even 10-year-old me thought that that was a stupid idea for a villain. But I also watched Spider-Man the Animated Series. You know, the one from the 90s. And for a good year of my life, that was probably my favorite TV show of all time. Now that my household has acquired Disney Plus, I decided to go back and rewatch the show to see if it was any good. And parts of it are really good. Parts of it are decidedly less good. But that combination makes for just a really potent viewing experience that I couldn't not talk about. And so I finally show my face on camera for the first time in like a year to tell you about that Spider-Man show where they weren't allowed to say the word blood, even though the word blood is literally in the theme song. Steroids, Alright, it's the 1990s and Marvel Comics is approaching bankruptcy. I know that sounds hard to believe in the age of the MCU, but Marvel wasn't really doing movies at this time, and their comic sales were declining. Not only were there a lot of independent comic publishers rising out of the woodworks to create more adult titles like The Watchmen, but also Batman was getting a lot of attention because there were a bunch of movies about him at the time. And also, DC killed off Superman for a while, and that kind of got people's attention. The only really successful thing that Marvel had going for themselves at the time was the X-Men animated series. They had outsourced production to Saban, and the series was really good because Saban knows what they're doing when it comes to animation. Also, the theme song was a bop. Marvel decided to go all in on the cartoon block, with Spider-Man being their next target. They even built a new company specifically to make this show and others called Marvel Films Animation. Bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see how it plays out for them. The studio originally tried to get Martin Pasco, the writer for Batman the Animated Series, to be the lead writer for the project, but that didn't end up happening, and eventually they brought in John Semper Jr. as a producer. He was told that he was supposed to be a story editor, but he showed up and realized that there was no story to edit, so he just decided to write it himself. Semper then asked Marvel and Fox to buy him a complete collection of basically every Spider-Man comic ever published, to which Marvel and Fox responded,
You serious?
Semper basically decided, well, if I'm going to do this thing, then I'm going to do it right, so he immediately began diving into 30 years of Spider-Man lore to get a feel for the series and its more iconic story bits. Marvel Comics themselves had very little creative control over the series because, well, bankruptcy, but there were plenty of other people who decided to cause problems for Semper's vision for the story. For one thing, at the time of the series' conception, James Cameron was actually trying to get a Spider-Man movie made, and he wanted Electro and Sandman as villains, and so Semper was forbidden from using them as villains. He used Hydro Man as a replacement for Sandman's role in the story, and he actually did get to use Electro later, but we'll get to that. He also came into conflict with Avi Arad, the show's executive producer, who tended to view the series more commercially than artistically. Basically, he viewed the entire thing as one gigantic toy commercial, and he would get into arguments with Semper about what characters could have toys made of them, and when they could appear, and it was a mess. People also criticized some of Semper's story choices, such as using Felicia Hardy as Peter's secondary love interest instead of Gwen Stacy. For example, Stan Lee heard about the change and thought that Felicia was going to be like ship endgame for Peter, and so he freaked out, but then Semper told him that Mary Jane was always going to be best girl, and he relented. Also, I'm fidgeting with like a necklace, so if you see random beads flying around, that's why. Semper also faced a lot of backlash for doing multi-episode story arcs. Other producers thought that the episodes should be completely self-contained so that younger viewers wouldn't get confused, and they forbade Semper from doing multiple episode arcs. And then Semper did it anyway, and it was a huge rating success, so then they shut up about it. The series is also somewhat infamous for the amount of censorship placed upon it, although according to Semper, the amount wasn't actually outrageous for the time, and Spider-Man was just a very high-profile case of it, so. Among the somewhat absurd requirements were that the characters weren't allowed to use words like die or blood, Spider-Man and the villains weren't allowed to punch each other, they couldn't show broken glass, and most infamously, the characters all had to use laser guns instead of, like, actual guns with bullets. My personal favorite censorship detail is that someone thought that the word sinister was too scary for children, so they forced Semper to change the Sinister Six's name to the Insidious Six, which, first of all, that's just significantly less cool, and second of all, on X-Men the animated series, they had the villain Mr. Sinister, and he didn't have to change his name to Mr. Insidious, so this entire thing is just dumb. The show's animation did gain notoriety for how faithful it was in recreating New York City. However, I must admit that the show's animation leaves some things to be desired. Reused footage is a problem, an almost comical one, and sometimes if an animation sequence didn't have enough frames, they will literally just slow it down, and it's painfully obvious. However, I do appreciate the art style, as most of the characters' designs are very close to what they look like in the actual comics, and that's a pet peeve for me when they change the characters' designs too much. I mean, they even kept Norman and Harry Osborn's weird dumb hair stripes, and that is dedication. The series' music was outsourced to Shuki Levy, and most of it is completely fine. However, there's this one song that they play every time something dramatic or tragic happens, and it's fine in isolation, but they play it so many times throughout the series that it becomes hilarious after a while. The theme song, which is great by the way, and you should listen to it, was performed by Joe Perry from Aerosmith, of all people. It interpolates the theme song from the 60s cartoon while also adding like an edgy 90s alt-rock flair, and I'm into it. The voice cast for this show are some of my favorite portrayals of these characters ever, and I could literally go on for an entire separate video about them. However, just some quick standouts, in my opinion, are Mark Hamill as the Hobgoblin.
Name's Hobgoblin, and you're right on time for your funeral.
Neil Ross as the Green Goblin and Norman Osborn.
You've been a thorn in my side for too long. You've pestered me as Spider-Man. You hurt my son as Peter Parker. Well, it all ends tonight.
Roscoe Lee Brown as the Kingpin.
At this very moment, I've begun an operation which will exterminate that wall-crawling vermin forever. Spider-Man.
Ed Asner, of all people, as J. Jonah Jameson.
A man in a mask. He aimed at me, but he hit her. Now I've sworn to keep this city safe from people who hide behind masks and think that they're above the law.
And Martin Landau as the Scorpion.
How about that? I beat Spider-Man! Taken out by the one, the only Scorpion!
However, a special shout out goes to the voice of Spider-Man himself, Christopher Daniel Barnes. Barnes was a relative unknown at the time. He voiced Prince Eric in The Little Mermaid, and he was in a couple Brady Bunch movies, but he absolutely destroyed this role.
It's set to detonate in 1 hour. Hey, don't look at me. Maybe you didn't deliver his paper this morning.
Can't you pry this thing off?
You want a trial separation already. I understand, but I'm hurt.
Now, there is one clip of him playing Black Suit Spidey that has kind of got passed around the internet, and that might make you think that he's like a bad voice actor, but I promise that was like his one off day, and the rest of the time he's good. I think Barnes kind of struggles with Peter's more angry and vengeful moments. He tends to like start speaking very deep in his chest, and his voice kind of loses its depth. However, he does get a lot better with it as the series goes on. Barnes is just great at conveying the range of emotions that Spider-Man experiences. The thrilling highs of victory, the despair, the frustration, and above it all, just the pride in his ability to, help innocent people. And to this day, he's probably my favorite portrayal of Spider-Man ever. Sorry, Tom Holland stans.
Huh? Where did you come from? Jersey.
I think the first season of the show is the best at recreating the general vibe of the Spider-Man comics. Like, the storytelling is more episodic and Monster of the Week style, and the overarching plots that are there don't involve vampires or Nazis. You think I'm kidding, but I'm not. It's also a lot like the comics in that there's frequent foreshadowing and setup to later episodes. Like, Eddie Brock doesn't bond with the Venom symbiote until episode 10, but he's around in the background making questionable journalistic decisions since episode 1. For the most part, this isn't one of those shows where the chronology is all jumbled and people will sit there making PowerPoints about what order the episodes should go in. Outside of one continuity flub in the first season, the airing order is the timeline order. Most of the characterization and given backstories are identical to the ones in the comics, just updated for technology or cultural reasons. One thing I should mention is that they decided to make Kingpin the big bad of the series. And in early Spider-Man comics, every villain's just kind of kicking around doing their own thing. But in this show, every bad thing that happens to the city of New York can be traced back to Wilson Fisk in some way or another. I don't really have a strong opinion regarding this change. It just kind of depends on whether you like episodic or linear storytelling in your Spider-Man content. It's just a thing. In general, there are small tweaks made to connect characters who didn't have any relationships in the comics. For example, in the show, Otto Octavius' funding for his research is being provided by the Hardy Foundation, and Felicia's mother pulls it when she realizes that he is insane. And so throughout the show, Dr. Octopus kidnaps Felicia and Anastasia multiple times, and it's like a recurring grudge that he has. Also in the show, they gave Dr. Octopus a German accent. I don't know why. Maybe they thought that him being a German doctor would make him scarier.
German doctor says they people last to mouth.
Cool.
In the comics, Spencer Smythe is a recurring big bad, and his son Alistair is, the guy who sometimes takes over a couple times a week. In the show, this is reversed. Spencer actually dies, or kind of, we'll get there, but he's knocked out of commission in his first episode, and then Alistair becomes like an assistant to the Kingpin because he wants to get revenge on Spider-Man because he blames Spider-Man for the accident that killed Spencer. I explained that poorly, but yeah. Also, Spencer wasn't even that evil in this show in the first place. He literally was only working for the Kingpin because he wanted enough money to build his son a cool hover chair. So like, we don't stand villainy, but like we stand the intent. Anyway, the other most notable adaptation change is that Craven is turned into, he's like turned insane by his girlfriend, Dr. Mariah Crawford, who is based on Craven's murderous lover, Calypso, from the comics. However, Mariah Crawford is like a chill human being, and she actually figures out a way to reverse Craven's insanity by the end of the episode. Yay! And now we have reached the alien costume arc, and I have things to say. So, a little history lesson in how Venom and the black suit in general was implemented in Spider-Man comics. Spider-Man accidentally stumbled across the symbiote during the Secret Wars storyline, and in the Amazing Spider-Man comics, he only keeps it for about 6 issues in 1984. Peter notices that the new suit has been making him tired, so he goes to Reed Richards for analysis, and Reed discovers that the suit has been taking over Peter's body while he was sleeping and making him go out and crime fight. From there, Peter is officially very anti-symbiote, and he gets rid of it pretty fast. It's implied that the lack of sleep was maybe making him a bit cranky, but the symbiote had no real direct effect on his personality. Amazing Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man are both supposed to be canon to each other, but it might just be me, but Peter Parker is significantly more like emo in Spectacular. I mean, Peter's always been like a little bit emo, don't get me wrong, but Spectacular Peter is more frustrated by the lack of appreciation he gets, and he threatens violence to people who don't deserve it way more often. In Spectacular Spider-Man, the Black Cat makes Spidey a cloth, not alien black suit to wear, and he wears it for about 4 years until Mary Jane gets kidnapped by Venom and politely asks Peter to not wear the costume that looks like her abductor, please. So even though the alien suit wasn't in Spectacular more, the black suit as a concept was, and I at least developed the mental association of Black Suit Peter being a jerk, even though that's the fault of inconsistent writing and not the suit itself. This leads us to Spider-Man the Animated Series, which was the first telling of the Venom arc to include the symbiote messing with Peter's mind as well as his body. The suit's enhanced powers make him arrogant and aggressive, both in web-slinging and in Peter's daily life. He doesn't notice the changes in himself at first, but Peter snaps out of it after he accidentally almost kills both the Shocker and the Rhino. The second fight scene against the Rhino is actually kind of terrifying, by the way. He, threatens to drop a giant metal door on him. It's scary.
All right, I give up. I'd rather go to jail than to be a snitch.
Who said anything about jail?
Huh? I don't get it.
You will.
It's like this. I'm through with not getting what I want.
What are you doing? I told you, I give up.
That's funny. I give up too. I give up trying to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man.
No, you can't.
Can't I?
From a narrative perspective, having the suit affect Peter's personality is just such a good idea. Bravo to whoever in the writer's room created it, and I think there's a reason why every Spider-Man adaptation since has followed suit. No pun intended. I also like the choices of negative traits that they accentuated because they're side effects of Peter's primary frustrations and character flaws. Like, his arrogance while under the suit's influence is an exaggeration of Peter's frustration with how he doesn't get enough respect from the public. Normally, he's able to put his own grievances aside for the greater good, but the suit makes him more selfish and causes him to overcompensate in order to fill that need for attention and appreciation. The aggression was also a good choice because there are very few times in the comics where we see Spider-Man genuinely set out to kill someone, and it is always frightening. The most notable example of this is in the death of Gwen Stacy. Spider-Man literally sets out to kill the Goblin after he kills Gwen, and the only reason Peter doesn't do it is because he doesn't want to have being a murderer in common with the Goblin. Peter is normally such a moral guy that seeing him swayed by his emotions that much is genuinely terrifying, and it does a great job of communicating what kind of emotional state Peter must be in to act like this. So amplifying that occasional drive for aggression not only communicates to us, the audience, that Peter is going through some crap with this suit messing through his mind, but it also gives Peter a very, very good reason to get that suit off right away and never come back to it. One trait I kind of wish had played more of a role was Peter's tendency for introversion. Like, Peter's an introvert by nature, and he works alone in his hero stuff, but when he is, like, genuinely upset, he tends to shut out all the people around him. Once again, a good example of this is the Gwen Stacy death arc. Harry is, like, just super high and super messed up from an overdose, and he asks Peter for help, and Peter basically tells him to F off. After the whole ordeal is done, Mary Jane asks if he would like to, grieve together, and Peter decides to yell at her for constantly maintaining a party girl facade, and he even says that she wouldn't be sorry if her own mother died, which is retrospectively awful, because in a later issue, Mary Jane's backstory is revealed, and plot twist, her mother totally died. My point is, I would just be interested to see a Venom arc that embraces this character trait more. Combine it with the arrogance, and you could have Peter talking about how he doesn't need anybody, so he isolates, but then that means that he's alone with his negative feelings, which means that the negative feelings get stronger, and he focuses on them more, and the cycle's only broken by May or Mary Jane or someone forcing him into social interaction, and then he realizes, oh wow, I'm depressed. Relatable. Honestly, the Alien Costume Trilogy is probably the show's best episodes because it does a great job of both streamlining the comics events and improving on them to make the source material better. It has some genuine emotional beats and terrifying fight scenes that are only slightly ruined by Barnes' voice acting.
You can't escape me! I'll chase you to the ends of the earth!
This show also did Eddie Brock a lot better than the comics did. Like, it took Marvel's writers 4 years to decide how they wanted to bring the symbiote back, so when they finally did introduce Eddie Brock, Peter doesn't remember who he is, and Eddie has to go on a whole diatribe explaining his backstory, and it's just clunky, whereas the cartoon introduced him as a minor antagonist from the start and gave him legitimate reasons to hate both Peter Parker and Spider-Man before he knew that they were one and the same. In general, I would recommend this entire show to anyone, but if you don't have time to binge the whole thing, or you just want to watch one episode to make sure it's good first, I would recommend the Alien Costume Trilogy, because it's honestly one of the most potent pieces of Spider-Man media that I've ever seen. After the Venom arc comes the Hobgoblin two-parter, which requires a surprising amount of explanation due to executive meddling. So, John Semper Jr. hated the Hobgoblin, but he somehow got forced into including him in the first season anyway. Reports of why vary. Some people claim that the Green Goblin was also being looked at by James Cameron for his movie, and some say that the previous showrunner had chosen Hobby and Semper just didn't notice it. Regardless, the end result was that Avi Arad had already told the toy production people to produce Hobgoblin action figures by the time Semper started trying to change it back to the Green Goblin. As you can imagine, Arad threw a fit, and he ultimately got his way because forcing the toy people to discard all their Hobby molds would just be too much of an inconvenience. Semper then tried to change it so that Norman Osborn was the Hobgoblin, but then Stan Lee found out about that, and he threw his own fit. The story that ultimately got told is that Osborn was the one who designed Hobby's suit and glider tech, but his payment for the costume was that Hobby had to go assassinate Wilson Fisk because he and Osborn are business rivals, I think. I'm sorry, it's been a couple of months since I've watched season 1. If I'm foggy on the details, that's why. It took me a while to write this script because, girl, it is 30 pages long, send help. The episodes themselves are remarkably coherent despite the rocky production, and I appreciate how they still kept Osborn connected to the Goblin tech so it wouldn't be weird when he used it later. I honestly don't have that much to say about the actual episode, I just wanted to talk about how it came to be, so moving on. The final episode of season 1 features the Chameleon. I do have to say, this show does a good job of making the Chameleon seem more threatening because he's always used to impersonate world leaders and other people of high importance. but they decided to have his powers come from a holographic belt that he wears, but the belt doesn't get disguised by, like, the hologram, which means that every time Peter or someone else is being tricked by him, you are literally just yelling at the screen, like, look at the belt, you fool. The chameleon actually has his power source changed later in the series, but then they never do an entirely chameleon-centric episode again, and it is literally so frustrating. So, Semper used this season to test run multi-episode arcs with the Spider Slayers, Venom, and the Hobgoblin, and they were pretty successful. So what does he do next? Make an entire season-long arc that involves vampires, man-spiders, and giant electric kaiju mutant people.
Ooh, I'm so scared I may start biting my fingernails. And man, have I got fingernails.
Season 2 was definitely one I watched a lot as a kid because I remembered most of the episodes from it vividly. Of course, that might also just be because this season seems to have been scientifically designed to traumatize children. The season opens up with the Kingpin commissioning some of Spidey's greatest foes together into the Insidious Six, and right around then, Spidey starts experiencing occasional loss of his spider powers. This is based off of Amazing Spider-Man Annual Number 1, in which Spider-Man battles the Sinister Six while experiencing a brief lapse in power because... well, they never actually explain it. It's implied to be somewhat psychosomatic because he loses his powers while he's feeling guilt about Uncle Ben and hatred for the Spider-Man persona, but then gains them back because he chooses to go into battle anyway because Betty Brant and Aunt May are in danger, but in retrospect that was dumb. The animated Spidey's issues persist though, and he goes to Kurt Connors for help. The good lizard doctor discovers that Spidey's blood is mutating and he may not be human anymore. Cool. The show briefly pauses that arc to give us a Hydro Man episode, and I will maintain to this day that this is the only piece of Spider-Man media that has managed to make Hydro Man genuinely intimidating, and this series deserves an Emmy for that. In this show, Hydro Man, or Maury Bench, is Mary Jane's possessive ex-boyfriend from high school. He thought that MJ broke up with him because he was poor, so he has now become a criminal, so he can steal her whatever she wants. Mary Jane eventually breaks it to him that she broke up with him because he was an obsessive weirdo, and Hydro Man responds exactly how obsessive weirdos react when you point out to them that they're being obsessive weirdos. This iteration of the character works for me, partly because his voice actor is great.
Boo, guess who? It's good to finally see you again, Red. It's been too long.
What is this?
I always said I'd give you the world. This is just the down payment.
And partly because, well, minus the superpowers, this is a thing that happens in real life to people. Primarily young women, like Mary Jane. And because of that, I think it's poignant that this episode ends with Mary Jane really being the one to defeat Hydro Man instead of Spider-Man. She uses his obsession with her to her advantage, and she lures him out to an area where there's less water so that he will be weakened and eventually evaporate. I think the showrunners were aware that they were getting into, like, adult fear territory, and so they had Mary Jane be more than just a typical damsel in distress, and it works for me. You may be wondering why I'm belaboring so much on a cheap 2-bit villain like Hydro Man, and that's because he's gonna reappear later, and it's gonna be stupid, so just keep all this information in your brain, okay? Back to our regularly scheduled weirdness, Spider-Man decides to head over to the X-Mansion in the hopes that Charles Xavier will be able to help him cure his mutation. Yep, it's a crossover episode. This crossover was more difficult than it really should have been to arrange, but remember, the shows are made by 2 different production companies. Also, most of the voice casts for X-Men the Animated Series were based in Canada, so the Spider-Man producers actually paid for the Canadian voice actors to fly out to LA and record for this special, so that's cool. I was hyped for this as a kid, I'm not even gonna lie to you, but the plot for this episode is weird. Xavier tells Spider-Man that he focuses more on training people to live with their mutations rather than curing them, and Spidey's like, well, I might literally be turning into a spider soon that's a bit worse than having telepathy, but whatever, and he leaves. Beast then tracks him down and tells him about a scientist named Herbert Landon who is doing experimentation to cure mutants, and sends Spider-Man over to him. However, it turns out that Landon is a crazy mutant racist who wants to commit genocide on them. And yes, they actually drop the G word in the episode. I appreciate that this episode leaned into the traditional X-Men allegories of using prejudice against mutants as metaphors for racism, homophobia, and every other brand of real-world discrimination. There's a short but impactful scene where Peter goes to one of Landon's demonstrations with this girl, and he abruptly ditches her upon learning that she's super anti-mutants. Not only is it setting a good example for younger viewers to not stand by when discriminatory views are expressed, considering that Spider-Man himself is turning into a mutant, his disappointment hits hard and is reminiscent of when someone in real life that you know turns out to be a jerk. More people need to do what Peter does here, myself included. Another example of metaphor comes with this side character, Genevieve. She starts off radically anti-mutant, but her views seem to falter throughout the episode, and eventually it turns out that she herself is a mutant. So the entire episode she was hating on herself, which is sad, and also reminiscent of people who don't realize that they're LGBT+, joining homophobic hate groups. This video suddenly got deep and I don't like it. So Landon wants to kill all the mutants by dipping them into this goo vat, but he falls into it instead, and it turns him into literal nightmare fuel. What is that?
That's not even nightmare fuel. That's nightmare fuel to, like, for the nightmare bus. They could drive off the nightmare cliff.
This is nightmare jet
into
fuel.
Nightmare Canyon.
But, like, also this is Landon's karmic punishment because he has become a mutant, the thing he despises, which is kind of symbolic for how some members of hate groups think that they're doing what they do out of love, and then they become the monsters of hate that they're accusing the other groups as of being. Why does it look like that? Like, all the X-Men mutants get these cool costumes, and my man is out here looking like Slimer ate Godzilla. Anyway, Landon's mutant form apparently lives off of oh, good lord, he got bigger. Why? Why? Okay, obviously I'm over-exaggerating my disgust for the sake of comedy, but this did actually scare me a bit when I was watching it, but don't worry. Spidey and the X-Men save the day, like they always do. Also, Landon gets permanently stuck as, like, half man, half whatever that thing is, but that doesn't happen until season 3, so. Spidey's friend, Dr. Crawford, has created a potential antidote to his mutation, but she warns him it might possibly make his powers disappear for good or even accelerate the mutation. Peter tries to experiment on a sample of his blood first, but this goes horribly wrong when the sample is stolen by competing student and Bela Lugosi ripoff Michael Morbius.
I had thought you would be my main competition, Parker, but you will be lucky to make it to the starting line.
Don't forget, Michael. The tortoise beat the hare.
In my country, we eat tortoises.
Okay, Morbius has been kicking around in the background of some of these previous episodes. Basically, all you need to know is that he comes from an unnamed but vaguely European country where everyone has a blood sickness that he wants to cure. He's competing with Peter and Deborah Whitman for a scholarship offered by Kirk Connors, and also he's dating Felicia. Morbius looks at Peter's, messed up blood, and he assumes that it's just some really successful science experiment, so he decides to try and replicate it, and he shoots it with the neogenic recombinator, which is basically just a fancy laser gun, but it's important to the plot, so remember it. He uses it on the blood sample, but a vampire bat flies in the way. Morbius tries to swat it away, and it bites him, which turns him into a vampire, except he absorbs plasma through these weird suckers on his palms. A couple of notes. In the comics, Morbius is a traditional suck-your-blood-be-a-fangs vampire. However, the network censors thought that showing Morbius biting his victims would be too violent for kids, and the alternative the showrunners came up with was having him absorb them through the palm suckers, and always referring to it as plasma. Gonna be honest, as a kid, I assumed that they called it plasma because, just like 90% of the characters on the show are scientists. Thoughts on the show's portrayal of Morbius are generally mixed. Some people think that he's too hammy to be taken seriously and think the sucker thing is dumb. Others think that it's honestly kind of its own brand of horrific because, it's not something you've ever seen before. You gotta give the show that. Personally, I'm neutral, because the sucker thing is kind of just what it is, and you can't have a vampire character who's not at least a little bit hammy. One thing I do think is kind of dumb is that Morbius is turned by a vampire bat. Like, vampire bats usually suck the blood of animals, so like, why can't Morbius go find a cow to kill instead of terrorizing random college students? Anyway, during a fight with Spidey, Morbius drops his cassette audio diary thing, and by rewinding it, Spidey learns about everything that happens. Since this occurred from an experiment with Peter's blood, he blames himself for Morbius's transformation, and he decides to go drink Dr. Crawford's serum in the hopes that it will get the mutation out of his blood, and the results are...
The pain! It's excruciating! Ah! No! No!
that. Believe it or not, this insanity does have actual source material. The Six Arms Saga is an arc that appeared in Amazing Spider-Man issues 100 to 102, and it is noteworthy for being the first appearance of Morbius, and also just one of the most insane things that Stan Lee has ever written. In the comics, the extra arm growth is not due to mutation, but due to Peter attempting to create a serum to get rid of his powers. It backfires, and he has to go to Kurt Connors for help, but Connors manages to reverse it. And also Morbius is there. He doesn't really have anything to do with the mutation, he's just like, there. I mean, tying Spidey's mutation and Morbius's transformation together is a good writing choice, but like, someone read that weird comic and thought, yes, this is a highlight of all Spider-Man stories and it deserves to be adapted for children. And that's the part that baffles me. Once daylight hits, Morbius actually turns back into just like a normal human, but he's clearly like very tired and weak, so everyone just kind of assumes that like Spider-Man beat him up for no reason. So they take him to a hospital, but then once night hits, he flies out the hospital window. Felicia jumps to the conclusion that Spider-Man has kidnapped him because, you know, ignoring the fact that there are like 700 superheroes in New York, many of whom have the power of flight or otherwise transporting themselves up to that height. Good job, Felicia. Also, once his mutation happens, Peter kind of has to leave the house, and then Aunt May reports him missing to the police, and the police kind of suspect Spider-Man of doing it, so then the Daily Bugle jumps to the conclusion that Spider-Man is also the one who's been draining everybody's blood, and it's a tangled web we weave, folks. The Punisher. Yes, we're bringing the Punisher into this now. Hears about all this and decides that Spider-Man should be his next target, but his friend Microchip asks him to do it non-lethally for once so that he can clean up his reputation. I mean, I'm going to make fun of the Punisher because making fun of things is what we do here, but I do genuinely like his portrayal. His voice actor really portrays the gruffness hiding a traumatized man.
No! I give up! No, really, I give up!
And then what? Get some Weasley lawyer? Spend a year or two in prison and then you're back on the streets again? Sorry, in this war there's no surrender.
Speaking of trauma, since they weren't allowed to show Punisher's family getting killed on screen, they went with this haunting imagery.
This is what I live for, webhead. To stop monsters like you from harming innocent lives.
So now our poor Spider-Boy is trying to fight Morbius and the Punisher at the same time. It's not going well for him, and then it happens.
Let it end like this.
Come on out. I'll make it quick and clean.
If you are an adult watching this clip for the first time, You will never understand the pure vitriolic reaction that this scene gets out of children. I wasn't alive in the 90s, but I have to assume that on the date this episode aired, just like the heads of children across the world just. I don't remember my exact reaction when I watched this as a kid. Like, I don't remember if I was scared or anything, but I do remember that that officially became the most exciting moment of my life. Nothing else mattered. A meteor could have crashed in my backyard, and the only thing I would have cared about is that it didn't, like, knock out our satellite reception, because I wanted to watch the next episode of Spider-Man and find out what just happened and what was going to happen next. I low-key want to watch this show with a bunch of children just so that I can see their faces during this scene. Like, you know how there are certain pieces of media where there's just one line, one particular moment where the penny drops and you can see the face of the person next to you change as, like, the realization of what is happening dawns upon them? This is that moment for me. For the rest of time, I will be looking for excuses to make people watch this show, because conceptually, the scene should be dumb, but they played it straight, and they played it for horror, and it worked. The Man-Spider technically originated in a Marvel fanfare comic from 1982, but there it was deliberately induced by a villain. This show was the first telling, and I believe the only telling, because I don't think any other adaptation since has retold the Six-Armed Saga, maybe because it's an effing weird story, to connect the Man-Spider to the Six-Armed Spider-Man. And like I said, this should be dumb, but they played it straight, and I just can't help but take it at least a little bit seriously. I mean, the Punisher has been completely stoic up until this moment. This even gets him to break.
I looked the devil square in the eyes, and I blinked.
Episode 8 of Season 2 is a weird one, because it's the only one in which, from a narrative structure standpoint, Peter is no longer our protagonist. Because, well, Peter's gone. As Man-Spider, all of his conscious thought is gone, and he's kind of just running on instinct and the occasional vague memory. We get a couple of very short scenes from his POV, but that's about it. The rest of the episode bounces between other characters and their reactions to the Man-Spider. Dr. Crawford eventually creates an antidote to undo the effects of her first antidote. I hope she tested this one. She calls upon Kraven to hunt down Spider-Man and administer it. Punisher and Kraven fight for a while due to misunderstandings, but eventually they get on the same page, and Spider-Man's mutation is reversed. He could still have a flare-up later, but for the moment he has the average amount of arms for your typical Spider-Man. Also, hey, can we talk about this ending scene real quick?
World Trade Center parking garage. How did you know?
The gravel that I found in Man-Spider's webbing. It still had the scent of gunpowder from that bomb explosion of years ago.
Clever. I'm impressed.
We would be magnificent together.
So, this show was really dedicated to recreating New York City, as I said, which means every once in a while you'll see the Twin Towers in the background of a shot and kind of just, like, wriggle uncomfortably in your seat. But I watched this scene and I was like, I'm sorry, when was this made again? As it turns out, the events of 9/11 were not the first attack on the World Trade Center. In 1993, some terrorists drove a truck bomb into the parking garage in an attempt to destroy the two towers. Thousands of people were injured, but fortunately only 6 people were killed and the towers still stood afterwards. However, reruns of this episode have usually edited out that scene, because in a post-9/11 world, holy crap, it really sounds like you're talking about 9/11. Also, this isn't the only episode that had to be altered because of 9/11. After the attacks, the last 2 images of Season 2 weren't aired again until 2007 because they prominently featured imagery of a burning skyscraper. The next episode introduces Blade the Vampire Hunter, who I personally don't like, but a lot of people in the 90s did. Sumper said that he introduced Blade because he wanted there to be a strong African-American superhero, and I can commend that. However, Blade's entire bit is being angsty and violent because of his mommy issues, and that's just not super compelling to me. I do have to acknowledge that his appearance on the show is relevant, though, because he was many people's first introduction to Blade as a character, and it's rumored that these episodes inspired aspects of the movie adaptations. In the show, Blade's mother is a regular human, and his father is a vampire. His mom gives him up for adoption because she doesn't want him to get wrapped into the world of being a vampire, and then she ends up getting turned into a vampire. So Blade has the super strength and speed of a vampire, but he's not weak to garlic. And when he was first born, he did not have like a thirst for blood, but as he's gotten older, that trait has emerged, and he represses it with a serum mixed by his inexplicably British friend Whistler. So now Blade is a vampire hunter because self-hatred and mommy issues, and he's come to town to kill Morbius. But Spider-Man is like, what if instead of killing him, I found a way to reverse his mutation? And Blade's like, F you. And that continues on for a while. So the neogenic recombinator, remember that? Kurt Connors has discovered that Spider-Man can prevent a future resurgence of the Man-Spider mutation if he takes a shot from the science laser once a day. However, Morbius decides to steal it because now he wants to use it to create more vampires. But like previously his goal was to cure himself of his disease, but now he's cool with it and wants there to be more vampire people, and this character development happened off screen because reasons. Also, Blade makes out with this police lieutenant woman for a bit, but they ultimately decide that they're from two different worlds and their relationship wouldn't work out. It's just kind of a thing. During the episode's climax, Felicia almost gets hit by the science laser, but Morbius pushes her out of the way because love, and the second recombinator hit turns him into a full-on bat monster. Horrified of his own appearance, he flies off into a cave to hibernate and to never walk Earth again, I guess. When I was watching this, I thought this was going to be the last we ever saw of Morbius, and I honestly wish it was, because that would have been hysterical. Meanwhile, Kurt Connors reports that he has found an artifact called the Tablet of Time that, according to myth, is rumored to be able to bring youth back to people. Silvermane, who exists, by the way, and has been trying to unseat Kingpin as the primary mob boss of New York, wants to use it so that he can become not old and have a better chance of ruling the city. The next two episodes are a lot of mob-centric stuff, which I personally am not as interested in. Basically, all you need to know is that Kingpin has a wife, and Silvermane has a daughter named Elisa, and they both get kidnapped, and there's a whole thing. Also, Peter almost goes on a date with Elisa, which is kind of hilarious. Oh, I forgot to update you guys on Peter Parker's love life, hold on. And you're laughing, but knowing which girl Spider-Man is currently being shipped with is actually a large part of my investment in, like, Spider-Man stories. Throughout season 1, Peter kind of bounces back and forth between Felicia and MJ. It's a real Archie, Betty, Veronica situation. He can't, like, get enough time with one of them to develop a preference for one over the other. At the beginning of season 2, Felicia starts dating Morbius, which leaves Peter and MJ free to get together. However, Peter is distracted from romantic entanglements due to the whole, oh my god, I'm turning into a spider thing. And MJ, because he can't tell her what's going on, so MJ just thinks he's being flaky and distant, so she starts dating Harry Osborn instead. This has been your Peter Parker's love life update. Now let's take a look at Wilson Fisk's love life. His wife just left him because she disapproves of his criminal occupation. That's gotta hurt, buddy. Silvermane manages to activate the Tablet of Time, but unfortunately it goes back in time too much, and Silvermane becomes a baby. Side note, in season 4, they cast an actual child to voice, like, baby Silvermane, and it's great.
Smite, I gave you this lab to develop a way to make me an adult again, not collect specimens.
Kingpin's men steal the tablet back, which is easy as taking a mythical time distortion device from a baby, but Kingpin doesn't want it because he's all heartbroken, so he tells them to sell it, and it ends up getting sold to Adrian Toomes. Yes, if you're familiar with 90s Spider-Man comics, we're doing this arc. Like, I love this show, but it chooses the weirdest things to adapt. In the show, Toombs owns an aeronautics business that is about to be bought out by Norman Osborn. He converts the tablet's power into gauntlets that he can use to steal the youth of people, and basically uses it to wage a reign of terror against Osborn. Eventually, he uses it on Spider-Man, and Spidey is now unable to stop the Vulture due to not being a 20-something-year-old crime fighter anymore. Another subplot that's happening for some reason is that the Scorpion believes that Kurt Connors could turn him back to normal, so he kidnaps the scientist who inflicted his condition on him, Harvey Stillwell, and goes to see Connors right when Spidey is showing up to ask for help. Connors reprograms Vulture's gauntlet so that they will suck up Spidey's mutation disease as well, and we are cursed with the lovely image of man, spider, vulture, person, woman, camera, TV.
Scorpion! Make them change me back!
Meanwhile, Stillwell is understandably scarred from all of the weird shit he's seen today, so he blows up all of Connor's computers that have neogenic research on them. Connors is upset because he was hoping to use that research to cure his lizardness, but Stillwell basically says too bad and walks off into a smoke cloud like a crazy person. And that was season 2, an insane story linking together a bunch of the weirdest comic arcs. Like, I was entertained by this season, so I can't say that, like, it didn't do its job, but every time I watch it, I'm just like, why? However, we're not quite done yet. Season 2 ends on a cliffhanger. Mary Jane receives a letter from a man claiming to be her father, and she asks Peter to go with her to meet him for moral support. Peter's like, hey, isn't Harry your boyfriend? Shouldn't he be, like, doing this role? And MJ just thoroughly dodges the question, so clearly their relationship is going great. As is usual for Spider-Man stories, Peter isn't able to show up on time due to spider nonsense, but he shows up early enough, or he shows up on time enough to see Mary Jane walking away with an older man. He tries to follow after them, but then they turn a corner, and when he turns the corner, they're gone. Ooh.
Come down here and fight like a man.
I don't suppose I could convince you to come up here and fight like a spider.
You may have noticed that my shirt has changed, and so has the lighting. Due to technical reasons, I'm having to record this video over multiple recording cycles, but I will try and always wear this jacket so that we can keep some level of consistency. Season 3 doesn't have an overarching story like Season 2 did, but I'm going to have to go through it episode by episode anyway, because it's just a really mixed bag. For every episode I really like, there's another one that's either just okay or straight up bad. The season subtitle is Sins of the Fathers because a lot of the episodes have to do with children picking up after the mistakes of their parents and sometimes possibly risking falling into them. For example, want to know where Mary Jane went at the end of the season? Well, the guy she thought was her father was actually Baron Mordo in disguise, and he has been using magic to reunite people with their dead or missing loved ones to form a cult for Dormammu, and when the members of that cult are asleep, Mordo possesses their bodies and makes them fly through the air and shoot lasers out of their eyes and, like, steal Doctor Strange's shit. Now, I actually like the parts of this episode that are more focused on the adult fear of, like, Peter watching the woman he loves, like, succumb to the lies of a cult. Everything else about this episode, from the concept up, weird. This episode also introduces Madam Web, the worst mentor character ever. So she claims that she's here to train Spider-Man for some epic task he must do in the future, but basically all she does to train him is yell a cryptic version of the episode's moral in his face and then leave. It's not very helpful. Like, in most Spider-Man media, say Spider-Man is fighting a foe who physically far outmatches him. Spidey would get his butt kicked once, and then he would pull himself together and go, okay, how can I outsmart this guy? In Season 3 of Spider-Man, what happens is Peter gets his butt kicked once, Madam Web shows up and says, "You must use your brain," and then Peter gets mad at her and doesn't use his brain out of spite and gets his butt kicked again, and then after that, he finally starts functioning like a normal human being. She doesn't mentally challenge Peter at all. Like, most of the messages she teaches him are things that he already knows about himself and is already trying to work through. So really, she's just a lazy way for the authors to directly state what the episode's moral is. And literally the only good thing about this character is that she's voiced by Stan Lee's wife, Joan Lee, who is absolutely thriving in this role.
My dear boy,
What?
whoever said that everything was supposed to be perfect?
Who said that?
I did.
Who's there? Who are you?
Isn't the real question, who are you?
After the weird cult-themed season opener, we get the Make-A-Wish two-parter. This is a cramming together of two different arcs from the comics. It's primarily based off Amazing Spider-Man 248, in which Spider-Man visits a leukemia-inflicted boy named Timmy, and seeing how much this kid looks up to him kind of restores Peter's will to live and fight as Spider-Man and stuff. It's saccharine, but nice. However, the writers decided that we couldn't go even one episode without a random villainous plot, so they also include one of my favorite arcs from the 60s comics, in which Doc Ock uses, like, a ray to wipe Spider-Man's memory, and he convinces Spider-Man that they are in cahoots, so Spidey spends several episodes thinking that he's a crook until eventually, like, Kazar knocks him into the ocean and the shock brings his memory back or something. But because the Doc Ock stuff is really just like a sidebar to the dying child plot, it doesn't really get to reach the same levels of dramatic intensity that it did in the comics, which is kind of a disappointment. The show changed the dying child in question from a boy named Timmy to a girl named Taina, and despite the episode literally being titled Make-A-Wish, the TV censors didn't allow them to actually say that Taina was dying, but when Spidey swings away from the building, we get a shot of, like, the entrance sign, and it says it's a building for terminally ill children, so, like, she's dying. Even though it was a censor thing and not really an artistic choice, I actually kind of like this decision, because by this time you've gotten at least minimally attached to Taina, so it hits harder than if you had known she was dying from the beginning. Also, knowing this and rewatching the episodes makes this line really sad.
You're not going now, are you?
No, I just need to clear my head. Do some web swinging.
Not without me, you're not.
No, Taina, I couldn't.
Please? Just once I'd like to see the world like you see it. Just once before.
Oh, all right. I suppose it won't hurt for you to come along on a quick trip.
When I first watched this, I assumed she was saying, like, before you have to go or something, but nope, she's totally referring to her own death. Anyway, Spidey kinda monologues to Taina about how he became Spider-Man, how the role has changed him as a person, and it gives him a chance to get some stuff off his chest, and then, oh god, Dr. Octopus is here. He wipes Spidey's memory, and Taina is the only person who knows he's not willingly working with Ock, so she recruits a team of New York cabbies to rescue him, all of which are a different racial stereotype. Swing and a miss! Also, this lady Mousy is Taina's primary point of contact, which is unfortunate for the audience because, good lord, is her voice annoying.
Nice moves, Mousy.
In the words of the immortal James Brown, I don't know karate, but I know crazy.
Anyway, Taina and the cabbies save the day. Somehow, I don't really remember this episode very well, but Spidey takes Taina back home, and considering that she's gonna die soon, he reveals his secret identity to her, and it's overwhelmingly fluffy, but I'm guessing that was the point, so I'll shut up. Next up, we get our first appearance of the Green Goblin. There's an explosion at Oscorp, and Norman doesn't exit it, so everybody assumes he's dead. So poor Harry now gets to deal with a bunch of pariah business people, including Jameson and Felicia's mother, trying to, like, take over Oscorp, and, yeah, our boy ain't handling it well. Suddenly, this dude named the Green Goblin shows up and starts kidnapping all of Oscorp's board members, so people assume that Harry has gone insane and is, like, avenging his father via the world's weirdest Halloween costume. However, in a fight with him, the Green Goblin reveals his secret identity as Spider-Man, and it's Norman, who survived the explosion, gained superpowers, and used some of his leftover tech from his deal with the Hobgoblin to launch his own reign of terror against people that he views as wronging him. But then, in the fight with Spidey, the Norman loses his memory of being the Goblin. You people know the general arc of every Green Goblin story, and this one isn't very different. Although, I'm not necessarily saying that as a bad thing. I actually think that the dynamic between Norman and the Goblin is one of the most ingenious and brilliant things that Marvel has ever created, and, like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Norman wants to be a good guy, probably even believes that he is deep down, but he does nothing to change his behavior. He doesn't stop his shady business dealings. He never makes more of an effort to be like a better father to Harry, and he never stops fixating on all the negative emotions that let the Goblin side of him take over. Any adaptation of Spider-Man that manages to encapsulate that will always be interesting to me. So I would actually consider this one of the better episodes, not just of the season, but of the series as a whole. I also have to give kudos to the writers for using, like, a leftover tech from his Hobgoblin dealing, because, like, just ignoring the Hobgoblin altogether and strictly adapting the comics would have been super clunky and awkward in this case, so I'm glad they did that. In terms of plot, the only other noteworthy thing you need to know is that Spider-Man saves Felicia's mother, because she's one of Oscorp's board of director people, and so now Felicia is in love with Spider-Man, because reasons, but Spidey turns her down because Spider-Man can't have a girlfriend. So yeah, all around, a very solid episode. Too bad it's followed by Rocket Racer. Season 3 is home to what are unanimously agreed to be the two worst episodes of the series, the Rocket Racer and Spot. Rocket Racer is about a kid named Robert Farrell who is stereotyped as being a bad kid, so he decides to become one, and he gets, like, a magnetic skateboard or something, and there's also a villain named Big Wheel. I don't remember this episode that much because it was bad. I personally would say that it's only the second worst episode, better than The Spot. Like, I'll talk about what's wrong with The Spot in a bit, but just know that it's, like, annoying bad, whereas Rocket Racer is just boring bad. I also appreciate that Rocket Racer at least attempted, like, a moral or a message, like, to that, you know, just because you are stereotyped as being a bad person doesn't mean you actually have to become one. You have the choice to choose to do good things anyway. Also, I don't know if this was intentional, but I think, given that Robert is a young black man, this might also be like a subtle commentary on racism. Like, black people, specifically young black men, are often stereotyped as engaging in criminal behavior, which leads to more black people engaging in criminal behavior because they think that they have nothing left to lose, which then just enforces the stereotype, and it's a vicious cycle. I might be giving the episode too much credit, but this show does specifically address racism subtly a lot, especially in regards to black people, so I don't think it's that much of a stretch. Either way, Rocket Racer at least attempted to have a good lesson for its audience, and it's stupid in a mind-numbing way rather than an infuriating way, so Next up, we have the Daredevil two-parter, which was intended as a backdoor pilot for a Daredevil cartoon that ended up never getting made. I like these episodes, but the setup for them is so weird. The Kingpin's son, Richard Fisk, decides to frame Peter Parker for federal treason. and it's so dramatic.
Terry, you know me. I wouldn't betray my country.
Parker, you better get yourself a good lawyer.
Peter's a good boy. There's got to be an explanation.
For his sake, I hope it's a good one.
Matt Murdock gets hired as Peter's attorney, and once he and Spidey become allies, he reveals to Spider-Man that the Kingpin is Wilson Fisk. Although Spidey has met both the Kingpin and Fisk, and Fisk doesn't wear a mask or anything, so I'm not sure how Peter didn't connect this by himself, but whatever, it's Saturday morning cartoon logic. This episode is most notable for the way it changed Daredevil and Kingpin's backstories to both entwine them more together and to be more thematically appropriate to the Sins of the Fathers theme. In the comics, Matt Murdock's dad is just killed by some random unrelated criminal, but in the show, he is specifically killed by the Kingpin. The changes to Kingpin's backstory are where it gets interesting, though. In the comics, Wilson Fisk was literally just a kid who got bullied a lot for obesity and decided to form a gang about it. No, really, that's the gist. In the show, Fisk's real name is Wilson Moriarty, and his dad is a small-time criminal who forces his son to participate in his schemes. One day, the cops show up at one of their robberies, and Moriarty Sr. decides to just leave his son behind to get arrested. Moriarty Jr. went to jail and learned a lot while there, and kind of just decided to form a criminal empire while in there. And he did it. For the fake philanthropist aspect of his plan, he changed his name to Wilson Fisk and killed everyone who had any knowledge of Wilson Moriarty, including his dad.
Only one thing remained to link me to the past.
We found him for you, Kingpin.
It is you. Nobody believed me, but I knew the famous Kingpin was really my boy, Willie.
Wrong. As far as the world must know, Willie ceased to exist when you left him in prison. Now, it's your turn.
No, please. Willie, don't do this.
I knew you were ruthless, but this...
The sacrifices must be made.
The reason this is interesting, though, is because of the episode's ending. Richard gets caught for framing Peter, and the Kingpin has a chance to confess his involvement and therefore possibly get his son a lighter sentence, and he doesn't. Kingpin is aware of the irony of the situation, and he even comments on being afraid that one day Richard will return the favor. And considering that in season 6, Richard was supposed to return in his criminal alter ego, the Rose, seems Wilson may have been right on that count. Fisk blames Alistair Smythe for his son's imprisonment for reasons I don't remember, I'm sorry. But anyway, he hires Herbert Landon, the mutant genocide kaiju monster scientist from before, to turn Alistair into the Ultimate Slayer, which is a cyborg, I guess? Landon calls him a robot, but Alistair has clearly retained some aspects of his, emotions and consciousness, so we're gonna go cyborg. Spidey convinces Alistair not to kill him by discovering that Spencer Smythe is actually alive in cryogenic suspension, so Alistair stops because he has no reason to want Spider-Man dead anymore, and now he sets out to do whatever it takes to bring his father back to not frozenness. Next up, we have Tombstone, who briefly appeared in a couple episodes before, but didn't really matter until now. Tombstone is the alias of Lonnie Lincoln, an old school friend of Robbie Robertson's who tried to convince him to lead a life of crime when they were teenagers, and blames Robbie for basically all of his subsequent arrests. Side note, remember how I said that the show addresses racism specifically towards black people very subtly and artfully?
I've always felt guilty that I got away and Lonnie didn't. And I felt even guiltier knowing that Lonnie never gave my name to the police. Back then, even one strike could ruin your life.
The subtext in that line is clearly back then for a black man. But they don't have to say it, but they're saying it without saying it. Like with Rocket Racer, the topic of racism is treated seriously without it bogging down the pacing of the overall story, and I just think it's a really good way to handle the topic. Writers in the audience take notes. Although, do note that I am a white person, so it's possible that I'm missing something and or being dumb. If I am, correct me in the comments. Anyway, Tombstone is here because the Daily Bugle was going to run a story about how Elisa Silvermane is taking over her father's business, but obviously she doesn't want that getting out, so she sent Tombstone to go intimidate Robbie into dropping the story. When Robbie stands firm, Tombstone then tries to blackmail Robbie by basically threatening to recruit his son Randy into his gang and ruin his life, but thanks to Spider-Man, that doesn't end up happening. After this comes the Carnage two-parter, which is, a doozy. So, as most people know, in the comics, Carnage is a serial killer, and he straight up kills, like, thousands of people every time he shows up in anything. But because of the censors, they couldn't actually say that he killed people, but they do allude to the fact that he did some pretty messed up shit.
Cassidy's not a man, he's a monster. He's done things even the Post wouldn't print.
The writers still wanted to have Carnage take lives in order to be true to the source material, but they didn't want it to be permanent. They wanted some kind of miraculous Ladybug-style plot device that Spidey could use to reverse everything at the end of the day. And, the solution they decided on for this was a second case for this season of unnecessary Dormammu. So Eddie Brock is in Ravencroft with his therapist, Dr. Ashley Kafka, who is the literal worst therapist in the world. So she treats two patients over the course of the series, Eddie, and then later when, spoiler, but later on when Harry goes insane and becomes the Green Goblin, she ends up treating him too. And this lady tries to convince these men that both Venom and the Green Goblin are nothing but figments of their imagination. Even though Spider-Man physically fought them and there are pictures of them posted in the Daily Bugle, this lady doesn't think they're real. I mean, gaslight, gatekeep, girl boss. Anyway, Dormammu, for some reason, wants Venom for his next evil scheme, so he sends Mordo in to reunite him with the symbiote and break him out of jail, and then the symbiote reproduces, and they give the resulting alien death monster to Cletus Cassidy. Because of this, Carnage considers Venom to be its father, which I feel like they only included because then it would fit the Sins of the Fathers theme, but whatever. Dormammu sends the two of them to go obtain a device from Stark Enterprises, which means, yes, we are now officially bringing Iron Man into this already overcrowded episode. Just accept it and move on. Stark is showing off a new invention called the Time Dilation Accelerator. For the record, throughout this review, I will be referring to it as the TDA, just to save time. Basically, it's a portal gun that can take you anywhere in time, space, and the multiverse. I don't know what that has to do with accelerated dilations, but that's the name of the thing. Venom and Carnage show up to steal it, but Venom quickly realizes that Carnage is having, like too much fun with this, and it's kind of starting to unnerve him. Eventually, Carnage tries to hurt Dr. Kafka, and that's what gets Venom to break, and he reveals that he is in love with her, even though she's clearly the worst therapist ever, and they had, like, very little romantic chemistry in their first scene together, but, like, whatever. Meanwhile, Dormammu has given Carnage the power to collect life energy so that he can enter our dimension. That's the kid-friendly version of Carnage murdering people. But Spidey and Venom team up to fight him, and ultimately Venom saves the day by closing the portal while he and Carnage are inside it, therefore presumably either killing them or sending them to another dimension for some other Spider-Man to worry about. That's foreshadowing, remember it.
Foreshadowing is a dramatic device in which an important plot point is mentioned early in the story to return later in a more significant way.
Next up, we have The Spot, the worst episode ever. Since the TDA has the ability to bring in monsters like Dormammu, Tony Stark decides he wants the operation shut down. The doctor who is working on the device, Dr. Jonathan Owen, gets hired by the Kingpin to continue his experiments, and one day he falls into the thing, and instead of getting sucked into the portals stick to him for unknown reasons, and so now he can create portals, and he looks like this, and he decides to call himself The Spot.
robbery on Sunday afternoon? What kind of nut would break into a bank in broad daylight? Oh, that kind of nut.
So this episode's bad for a lot of reasons, partially because it's just very hard to make a man named the Spot sound intimidating. Also, as I said, to my memory, there is no real explanation as to why the portals stick to Own and not to any of the countless other characters who fall into these portals over the course of the series. I just don't find Own to be a very compelling character. Like, this is a more subjective complaint, but his voice is really annoying.
Whoa! Ooh. Did that hurt? Sorry, I'm in something of a hurry. Bit of a goof setting off those alarms, eh?
And he doesn't even want to be like a villain necessarily. He just wants to like rob banks so that he doesn't have to work and can buy a flat screen TV or whatever. And like I guess they're trying to create moral ambiguity, but I feel like the episode would have been a lot more entertaining if this dude just walked out of the portal and was like, "What up? I'm the Spot. Oh, you think that's a silly name, do ya? Why don't you tell that to the townsfolk of wherever the heck you just got teleported to, MFer?" Like, that would be interesting, but this guy is just a sniveling coward. I will say, the show does an admirable job of trying to make his powers cool, but I just can't help but care, because this man's name is the Spot, and he has the voice of the conniving mayor of an otherwise quaint British hamlet. I don't even remember how the episode ends, to be honest, but the important thing is that the Spot gets despotted, and now the TDA is growing more well-known in New York, which of course means that there are villains who want to use it for their own nefarious purposes. Concluding the season, we have 2 more goblin-centric episodes, and some fun and exciting updates on Peter Parker's love life. Mostly in the form of the girls he likes getting engaged to other people. Peter learns via newspaper column that Harry and Mary Jane are engaged. He goes to MJ, and he's like, how are things with Harry? And MJ's like, "Oh, he's so sweet, and he's always around when I need him." And then Peter asks her, "Do you love him?" And she doesn't answer, which leads Peter to the conclusion that, like, his inability to keep a date has effed up MJ so badly that she is now just throwing herself at the first guy who shows up on time for the date. So, like, that's fun. Meanwhile, Felicia Hardy has also gotten engaged to some dude named Jason. Now, I'm gonna spoil something for you here. Jason is the Hobgoblin. I mention this because Mark Hamill, or the voice director, or someone decided that Jason needed like a really distinct voice, and they went with this.
Personally, I find these soirees to be ever so tedious, but Felicia absolutely revels in them.
The Green Goblin personality starts reappearing in Norman, and he asserts his control back over him in what might be one of the show's best scenes, in which the Goblin appears in Norman's bathroom mirror and berates him for being too weak to face Spider-Man.
Kingpin, the Hobgoblin, Spider-Man. They're all trying to hurt you, squeeze you, crush you.
Yes, that's exactly what they're doing to me.
And that's why you should let me stop them.
It would be wrong.
Wrong is what they're doing to you!
And what they want to do to Harry.
I can't.
You can! You must! Let me out, Norman. Let me out now!
No, no, no!
If you're wondering, it is rumored that Willem Dafoe and the makers of the original Spider-Man trilogy took inspiration from this season of the show for their characterization of Norman. Both the Green Goblin and the Hobgoblin are after the TDA, and each goblin thinks that they're the real goblin, Slim Shady style, so it's time for a goblin war. The Green Goblin wins, and Felicia learns that her boyfriend is a sociopathic criminal, so fun. The Green Goblin decides to use the TDA to learn Spider-Man's secret identity. He pops up a portal like right behind where Spider-Man is changing out of his outfit, and the Goblin sees that he is Peter Parker. The Norman half of the Norman Goblin functioning set, I guess. But anyway, we'll just say, they realize that, Peter has been the main obstacle between Harry and Mary Jane getting together, so they take that as more evidence that, like, Peter is trying to, like, ruin the Osborn family's lives, or whatever. Norman invites Peter to Harry's engagement celebration party, I guess, and based on the fact that Norman is acting nuttier than a Snickers bar, Peter quickly realizes that the goblin knows his secret identity and is, like, trying to goad him into a fight. This dinner party scene is based off Spectacular Spider-Man magazine #2, in which Norman invites Peter, Harry, Mary Jane, and Gwen over for a party, and Peter has to try and make things seem normal to the other three while also not doing anything to throw Norman over the edge and get them in danger. It's one of my favorite scenes in Spider-Man history and has been adapted tons of times, but the fact that Peter doesn't know that Norman knows his secret in this version adds a bit of an edge to the whole thing. Like, comic Peter literally remarks that he's walking into a lion's den before the whole thing starts, whereas cartoon Peter is completely blindsided. The fact that he's still able to keep pace with Norman's verbal sparring in this version just makes him seem that much more clever. Eventually, the facade breaks, and at one point Norman even does the fly with unmasked Spider-Man on his glider thing. You may have noticed that this episode is kind of just like a montage of Norman Osborn's greatest hits from the comics. So when he kidnaps Mary Jane and takes her to the top of the George Washington Bridge, you start to see where this is going. What precedes is basically a scene-for-scene remake of the night Gwen Stacy died, except instead of dying, Mary Jane and the Goblin both fall into TDA portals. This is, as you can imagine, unsatisfying. Okay, it's not that I wanted MJ to die in this episode. Like, MJ is my favorite Spider-Man love interest. Of course I don't want her to die. But the death of Gwen Stacy is such an iconic moment, not just in comic history, but just in pop culture in general, that recreating it this way feels kind of cheap. Like, you're trying to warrant the same reaction from your audience that that comic did without making the same level of commitment to killing off one of your key characters. I don't think people realize that before Gwen Stacy died, she was, like, Spider-Man's primary love interest, like how Mary Jane is for us now. Like, MJ and Peter went on, like, 2 dates, but Peter decided, like, she was too ditzy for him, and he didn't want to, like, mess with that. And so MJ kind of had a thing going around with Harry in the background, but she basically wasn't taken as seriously as Gwen was. Gwen was the girl who was in every issue, and she got taken by the narrative more seriously as well. Like, her dad died and she hated Spider-Man, and Peter had the push and pull of how do I date her while being Spider-Man? Like, if I revealed my identity to her, what would she do? And hot take, if you don't feel like adapting the death of Gwen Stacy, instead of doing this portal nonsense, you should just have Peter reveal his secret identity to Gwen, and then she hates Spider-Man so much that she literally can't get over it and breaks up with him. Okay? Like, that. Just saying. This episode, like, so clearly thinks that it is emotionally on par with the death of Gwen, but, like, it's just not. Like, don't get me wrong, I like MJ, and I'm sad that she's gone, but, like, she ain't dead, sis. I think it's also just that, like, the camera angles and, like, the storyboard are clearly so derivative of the original comic. Like, the Goblin gets pushed into the portal by, like, the sharp point on his glider, and in the comics that, like, stabs into his stomach and kills him, and that is, like, a really powerful symbolic moment, because Peter laxes in his beating of Norman for 1 second, and then Norman still takes that opportunity to try and literally stab him in the back, but Norman is the one who gets stabbed, so it's like the narrative saying that Spidey was right to not kill Norman. Like, resorting to violence is only going to lead to you dying of your own violence, like dying on your own sword, being hoisted by your own goblin glider petard. Like, it was a very, like, powerful and symbolic moment but that symbolism is lost here because he ain't dead, sis. There's also this one shot that they keep playing in flashback scenes where the TDA falls into the ocean and Spidey shoots webs after it, and it's so clearly meant to resemble that one panel of Peter shooting web lines after Gwen, but instead of rescuing his girlfriend, he's rescuing a souped-up film projector. Anyway, now Norman and Mary Jane have both disappeared into portals, and Madam Web shows up and is like, I could help you, you know. And Peter's like, you haven't done jack all season, so go away. And Madam Web's like, you're choosing to go at this alone, which is the wrong choice. Except the audience agrees with Peter that she is useless, so instead of it being Peter's tragic downfall amidst the throes of grief, it's a cause for celebration. And then season 3 ends with Peter vowing to find MJ, but having no idea how. What a wild ride that was.
I should reevaluate some of my male chauvinist preconceptions.
I don't like season 4. I'm just gonna say that up front. I mean, it's still watchable, and it's still far better than the entirety of Spider-Man 1981, but it's, for me personally, it's just a massive downgrade in writing quality. After another Tombstone-centric episode, which is good but not relevant to the overall season plot, we finally get the story of how Felicia Hardy turns into the Black Cat. I'm honestly surprised that they kept her around for 3 seasons without doing this, but hey, we like slow burns here. Most people know that in most Black Cat iterations, her dad is a cat burglar. In the comics, her dad is just a guy named Walter, and Felicia kind of just decides to follow on in his footsteps. And later in some of the comics, she does get the Kingpin to lend her the ability to mess with probability, but she ultimately has that undone, so she has no superpowers. In the show, Felicia's father is a guy with a really good photographic memory named John Hardesky, and he gets tricked by Nazis into memorizing the super soldier formula. And then he spends the rest of his life getting hunted down by Nazis until eventually the Kingpin and Dr. Octopus get the formula from him, and then they use a version of it on Felicia, and that's how she becomes the Black Cat. What? Additionally, in the comics, Felicia just kind of naturally has white hair, but in the show, she gets a magical transformation sequence that gives her not only white hair, but also a few inches in height and abs, because male gaze. Newly emboldened by her superpowers, Felicia decides to use her Black Cat persona to kind of put the moves on Spider-Man, and so the next 4 episodes follow a pattern of Felicia, or Black Cat, asks to be his crime-fighting / romantic partner. Spidey says no. Felicia proves herself to be helpful in battle. Spidey says, okay, fine, you can stick around. And there's multiple episodes of that, and it gets annoying after a while. One thing that definitely doesn't help is that Jennifer Hale, who otherwise does a fantastic job of voicing Felicia, puts on this more husky voice for the Black Cat, and I guess it's probably supposed to make her sound more mature or hot or whatever, but it just gets grating after a while. Although, I guess I should note that, I'm not attracted to women, so if there's a seduction factor there, it's not working on me.
I knew you'd come, Spider.
Who are you?
Just a stray Black Cat.
The thing that gets me with this is that they really bungled Black Cat's role in the story. In the original comics, when Black Cat is introduced, Mary Jane has broken up with Peter and moved to another part of the city because they had a fight or something. It's not important. But anyway, this is done so that the comic writers can test out how people feel about the Felicia and Peter ship without having to worry about Peter, cheating on MJ or anything. Side note, the aspects of Peter's personality that Felicia brings out and the aspects of the Venom suit bring out are very similar. So the perfect solution to this is just introduce Black Cat and the Venom symbiote at the same time, and then have Peter almost cheat on MJ while under the influence of the suit. That would be some relationship drama. But no, we gotta throw MJ into a dimensional portal or something. Anyway, Felicia / the Black Cat is like your emo alternative to Mary Jane, right? So this whole thing is building up to a moment where Peter has to choose between them, and that's also kind of inadvertently telling us what kind of character arc Peter is going to go on. Is he going to go on the happy sunshine route or the emo night prowler route? But in this show, not only does Peter choose MJ with no emotional conflict whatsoever, but they take Felicia out of the story before MJ comes back, and the way that they do it is so stupid. Dr. Connors and Deborah Whitman discover Morbius's bat form in a cave, and then the writers retroactively add to the story that Deborah Whitman was in love with Morbius but had to stifle her feelings because Morbius was in love with Felicia. In season 2, there is very little, if any, like, hints that Deborah was into Morbius, and it's just very sudden, but you know what? Whatever, Spider-Man the Animated Series. Canon doesn't exist anymore. Do whatever you want. I will even overlook the fact that Morbius' story arc was basically complete and you didn't really need to bring him back. Season 2 was popular. You're trying to clickbait people. I get it. Dr. Landon finds a way to turn Morbius back into his normal, not a bat, but still a vampire state. And Blade's mother, who is an evil vampire queen, by the way, learns of his existence and asks him how he became a vampire, and once she finds out, she decides to use the Neogenic Recombinator to create an army of vampires. Side note, wasn't the Recombinator destroyed by Stillwell in the season 2 finale, or am I remembering that wrong? Meanwhile, Felicia hunts Morbius down and tells him that there has not been a day since he turned into a vampire that she has not stopped loving him, even though a day ago she was proclaiming her undying love for Spider-Man. This arc is so bad. Eventually, Morbius and Blade decide to team up and head to Transylvania to become vampire hunters, and the Black Cat decides to go with them, which means she's leaving Spider-Man, and then literally the next episode, Mary Jane comes back. Why? So, the struggle with writing other Spider-Man love interests is that your audience either knows or expects that Mary Jane is going to be Endgame, because she is the most iconic of his love interests. They were married for like 20 years until they did the stupid Mephisto thing. Like, everyone kind of wants her and Peter to get together at the end, which means that I think they were kind of afraid to give Peter and Felicia the character development that they really needed to be taken seriously as a ship. This entire season feels like the first draft of a school essay that you finish at like 8:30, and then the next day in class you're proofreading it and you're just like, what was I on drugs? Like, all of the individual parts are there. It just needs like massive restructuring to make it all fit together better. I mean, this entire show has issues with that sort of thing, but it's just painfully evident here because, like, the first 6 to 7 episodes of the season are a buddy cop movie, and then the rest of it's just normal Spider-Man, because Felicia does not appear for the entire second half of the season. Also, I personally just have mixed feelings about Black Cat as a character, which probably affected my viewing experience. I like the concept behind her, but let's be honest, in execution, there are a lot of writing choices that are made where it's clear that the male writer's room didn't think to, like, ask their girlfriend or a female coworker, or maybe just literally any woman off the street. This show mostly avoids that sort of thing. As I mentioned, male gaze is a problem in the camera angles and shots, but the writing itself doesn't make her feel like super sex object-y, but it still clearly doesn't know what to do with her, possibly because it doesn't have good source material to work off. And so after being built up as like a possible new main character, she gets put on the bust of Vampire Town and isn't seen again until season 5. Next up, we get the return of the Punisher and Harry Osborn's ascension to goblinhood. So Anna Watson is really suspicious of Peter claiming not to know where Mary Jane is, and to be fair, in the real world, when a boyfriend goes out with his girlfriend and the girlfriend doesn't come back, that man is usually a murderer, so like, I kind of get you, Anna. Distraught, Anna goes to the cemetery to grieve MJ's parents, and she happens to run into the Punisher, who is mourning his own family. What a coincidence. Anna kind of vents her frustrations to the Punisher, and he decides to hunt down Peter Parker and maybe kill him. Maybe. If he feels like it. Meanwhile, Harry has started seeing and hearing the Green Goblin. For the first half of the episode, it's left kind of ambiguous whether or not this is actually the Goblin or just Harry going insane, but by the end of the episode, it is confirmed to be Norman / the Goblin stuck in wherever the TDA took him. Also, the Goblin only appears to Harry through reflective surfaces like mirrors and windows. I don't know if that's just like a stylistic choice by the art director or if it's like a limitation on the Goblin's powers, but either way, it's kind of weird and never explained. The Goblin tells Harry that if he becomes the second Green Goblin, he will be reunited with his father soon. Desperate to see Norman again, Harry complies, puts on the Goblin outfit, goes slightly insane, as you do. Meanwhile, the Punisher has come to the conclusion that Peter is the Green Goblin.
I know I'm right. What's this, Parker? What the devil?
Well, what do you know? That must be me up there.
Anyway, there's a fight. Spider-Man breaks it to Harry that his father is the Green Goblin. After Norman confirms this himself, Harry goes full-blown insane, as you do. And then after the fight, Peter swings him over to Ravencroft, where Ashley Kafka will definitely give him quality mental health care. A lot of fans of this show don't really like Harry as the Goblin. I personally don't mind him, because it's difficult to write Harry as the Goblin, because not only is he kind of overshadowed by his father's run as the Goblin, but also in this series you also have the Hobgoblin to compete with. Wow, both narratively and fictionally, Harry Osborn is kind of always overshadowed by other people and never allowed to, like, thrive as his own person. That's kind of sad. After the Goblin stuff resolves, the camera pans down and we see Mary Jane has been watching the fight, and then later that night, she goes to Peter's house and delivers this line in a totally natural way that doesn't make her sound like a robot.
Peter, I've come back to you.
She claims to have no memories of where she was for the past several months, which is a bit of a red flag, but Peter is so overjoyed to see her that he lets it go and they start dating again right where they left off. Next up, there's a weird episode with Mysterio where he has a beauty-obsessed girlfriend who wants to steal MJ's body so that she can be young forever, and then Mysterio and her die together in the basement of an abandoned building. And I guess it's cool character development for Mysterio, but it's kind of just very out of left field. The big noteworthy thing is that at the end of this episode, Peter reveals his secret identity and proposes to Mary Jane, and she says yes!
Yeah! She said yes! She said yes! She said yes! Ah! Huzzah! Ah! I'm shaking, Hank. I'm so excited I'm shaking.
Then there's an episode where Kurt Connors accidentally creates a race of lizard people, and another episode centered on the Prowler, which has a good story, but is structured weirdly so that the episode is like 60% flashback, but like other than that it's fine. So yeah, I don't like season 4 as much as the other seasons, but it's still watchable. I just feel like a few more structural edits and revisions could have made it a lot more narratively coherent than it is.
This is starting to sound like a bad comic book plot.
it gets worse.
Season 5 is comprised of a bunch of individual mini-arcs that sometimes tie into one another and other times were included because the writers thought they were cool. The season opener depicts the wedding of Peter and Mary Jane, which gets hijacked by Harry Osborn, who recently broke out of the worst mental health facility ever. He's still fervently in love with MJ, so he threatens to blow up the church unless she marries him. But then Liz Allen, who has been a background character since season 2, by the way, shows up and proclaims that she's in love with him. Harry's big emotional hang-up is that he never received sufficient signs of his dad's love as a kid, so someone directly telling him that they care for him just kind of like wows him and gets the goblin persona to leave. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because it's sad. And then Peter and MJ get married, and it's cute. Also, the Scorpion kidnaps Aunt May for some reason. Also, the Kingpin pays for their wedding, I guess to try and keep Peter complacent after that time he was framed for federal treason. Also, J. Jonah Jameson's wedding gift to them is a Daily Bugle fan. A tad chaotic, but a good season opener. Too bad Peter and MJ's marriage is going to be rendered null and void in about 7 episodes from now. Our first mini-arc is the 6 Forgotten Warriors, which I hated. No, hate is too strong of a word. I was just thoroughly bored by this arc. Like, not a single aspect of it was interesting to me. For one thing, it starts out with Peter investigating into his parents and finding out that they were secret agents, and I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion in the Spider-Man fanbase or whatever, but I'm gonna say it anyway. I personally think that the decision to make Peter's parents secret agents is the dumbest thing I have ever heard in my life. A big theme within the Spider-Man stories is that before the spider bite, Peter was just a guy, and he hated that. He had, like, resentful nerd energy, which I think a lot of my fellow nerds can relate to when they were teenagers. But then once he realizes the responsibility that comes with having the power of being Spider-Man, he wishes that he could go back to being just a guy. He wishes that he didn't have to, like, show up late to class because he's tired because he was fighting Doc Ock the night before. He wishes he didn't have to stand up girls on dates, that he didn't have to worry for his life or the lives of the people that he loves all the time. And, like, people who don't know that Peter is Spider-Man still see him as just a guy. So combined together, all of this presents themes of, like, some people have reasons for their crappy actions sometimes, like, and everyone can be a hero as long as they understand that credo of power and responsibility, and, you know, be careful what you wish for, appreciate the things that you have in your life, and be careful who you call ugly in middle school. If you make Peter special before the spider bite, you are missing what I consider to be one of the fundamental characteristics of not just this character, but the story as a whole. I personally would count having secret agent parents as kind of effing special. At the same time, Peter's parents do still need to be dead, or at least unable to take care of him, because he definitely has a dynamic with Uncle Ben and Aunt May that's different than parent and child, and I guess most people don't have 2 dead parents, so that's kind of making him special, but I can accept that because protagonists have dead parents. Also, in the comics, Peter has all this expensive science equipment despite May seemingly not working and Ben being, like, a factory worker. So I always kind of headcanoned that Peter had one or both parents who was, like, an accountant or a science teacher, not a secret agent. So yeah, as I'm reviewing this particular story arc, keep in mind that I think the Peter's parents arc was stupid when they did it in the 60s, and the fact that they brought it back for Spidey's 30th anniversary is borderline offensive to his legacy. Anyway, back to this specific show. Peter finds out that his parents are believed to have been communist double agents, so he travels to Moscow to clear his parents' name. Why? The Insidious 6 are there. A lot of BS happens. Basically what you need to know is that the Red Skull was trying to build a doomsday weapon to blow up America. In this show, instead of being frozen in ice, Captain America and the Red Skull get trapped in this time-freezing vortex thingy for 50 years, but the Red Skull is freed from it by Reinhold Kragov, who is a corrupt police officer and also his son? Also, the Red Skull apparently took in the Chameleon as his foster son, which, A, is not true to the lore of the comics. In the comics, the Chameleon is like Kraven's half-brother or something. He has no connection to the Red Skull at all. But also, that would imply that the Chameleon is at least 50 years old. And now that I'm thinking about it, Kragov himself doesn't even look like he's 50 years old. He looks like he's like 30. I don't understand. Anyway, in order to activate the Doomsday device, the Skull and Kragov need 6 keys, which are possessed by the 6 Forgotten Warriors, who are Captain America and 5 of his friends that he fought with in the 40s, which basically means that this entire arc is an excuse to introduce kids to heroes from the golden age of Marvel, which I'm okay with. I think it's cool to bring back some of those characters sometimes, but like, I just don't like how they wrote it here. Part of it is just because, like, pacing issues, because, okay, I'm about to spoil this whole season for you. In this season, we're going to do not only this 6 Forgotten Warriors thing, but also a thing with Hydro Man, the Secret Wars, and the Spider Wars, which is basically a Spider-Verse style thing. And they decided that you have to have the wedding episode as the opener. I agree with that. But then they decided to give 5 episodes to this 6 Forgotten Warriors thing, 2 episodes to Hydro Man, 3 episodes to Secret Wars, and 2 to Spider Wars. And I feel like time could have been better used here. After a lot of nonsense, Spidey gathers the 6 Forgotten Warriors, and they all suit up and stuff, and then the Red Skull reveals that he experimented on his son, and now Kragov has electrical powers and has taken the name Electro. Yeah, James Cameron's movie never got produced, as you can tell by the fact that, you know, there wasn't a James Cameron Spider-Man in Spider-Verse, or in No Way Home. But yeah, that movie didn't get produced, which meant now the writers could finally use Electro, and they decided to make him the Red Skull's son. I cannot express to you enough how hilarious Electro with a German accent is to me.
Auf Wiedersehen, Spider-Man!
One thing that I will give Kragov Electro is that he literally takes down an entire SHIELD helicarrier by himself, and that takes guts.
Another Neanderthal in a costume?
Don't underestimate the Red Skull. If he says he's created something of great power, there's only one way to find out.
However, in the end, he is defeated by Spidey and the 6 Forgotten Warriors. Cap and Red Skull go back into the time vortex, which means nothing happened with that aspect of the story, and the other Forgotten Warriors are finally remembered instead of forgotten. Yay. Next up, we have the Return of Hydro Man 2-parter, and if you are not already sitting down while watching this, I suggest you find a seat soon, because, like, this arc is not going where you think it is. Peter and MJ were supposed to have their honeymoon at Niagara Falls, but they had to put it off because Peter had to go to Moscow to prove that his parents weren't federal criminals, and while there, he ended up meeting Captain America. After all that nonsense, Peter and Mary Jane are really hoping to just have some nice time together, but then of course Hydro Man has to show up and start trying to steal her away. Literally steal her away. I mean, he kidnaps her. Spider-Man enlists the help of Black Cat, who is here. I don't remember why, y'all. But anyway, she's here. Spidey and the Black Cat work together to find MJ, and then when they do, it turns out that she also has hydro powers. Okay, here's the twist. A scientist named Miles Warren made a clone of Hydro Man. Clones share their originals, like memories and feelings, and in this case, obsessions. So clone Hydro Man forces Warren to make a clone of Mary Jane. He does, but because clones share their memories and feelings, clone MJ doesn't like clone Hydro Man, so she escapes from Warren's facility and kind of wanders around New York for a while until she eventually finds Peter and delivers that one line in a very unnatural and robotic tone.
Peter, I've come back to you.
Just to make sure that we're all on the same page here. The real Mary Jane is still trapped in portals or wherever the TDA took her. And the Mary Jane that Peter revealed his secret identity to and married was a Hydro clone the whole time. I don't even know what to say here, because I think the insanity of this plot speaks for itself. So all I'm going to say is that this now makes how they handled Black Cat even worse, because she didn't even get bussed for the real MJ, she got bussed for a clone. Warren then reveals that both clones are unstable, and literally as he's speaking, Hydro Man and MJ start to evaporate. I will say, even though this twist is absurd, clone MJ's goodbye to Peter actually kinda gets me in the feels.
Before I go, I want you to know just one thing. If any part of me is anything like the real Mary Jane Watson, she loves Peter Parker more than anything in the world. More than anything.
No! Mary Jane! Mary Jane!
There's a brief scene where Warren manages to obtain some Spider-Man DNA, which should be tripping alarms for some of you who are familiar with the 90s comics. Don't worry, that arc's gonna make it in here too. As Spidey is literally still mourning his clone wife, Madam Web shows up for the first time since season 3 and says now it's time to charge Spidey with the ultimate test or whatever. He gets taken off to Madam Web's boss, I guess, who is this dude named the Beyonder. Basically, the Beyonder wants to see who would win in a battle of good and evil, so he took a utopian planet, dropped a bunch of Marvel villains on it for a year, and is now going to send Spidey on to lead a team of superheroes to try and unfix what the villains did.
You had to wreck an entire civilization to prove that evil is bad? For such a powerful being, you're a few stars shy of a galaxy, pal.
So the Beyonder chose 5 villains: Dr. Doom, Dr. Octopus, the Red Skull, Alistair Smythe, and the Lizard. First 3 on that list, genuine terrors. Alistair really only cares about like bringing his dad back to life, and this planet doesn't have magical unfreezing tech, so like literally as soon as Team Spidey gains the upper hand, Alistair is willing to work with them, and Reed Richards figures out a way to make Kurt Connor's brain dormant in the Lizard's body, which means that the Lizard isn't even a villain here, and he was never intended to be. That spot on the roster was actually supposed to go to the Hulk, but there was a Hulk cartoon airing on a rival channel, so Fox forbade them from using him, which means that this is even more stacked in the hero's favor. Also, apparently Spidey was also supposed to have all of the X-Men on his side, but they didn't have the budget to fly in the entire Canadian VA crew again, so they only got Storm because her voice actress is based in LA. So this means that it's essentially free villains and Alistair Smythe against Spider-Man, the entire Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Captain America, Storm, the Lizard, and then later on Spidey actually brings the Black Cat in too. Like, there was no way Spidey was going to lose. This is BS. So basically on this alien planet, Doom, Octopus, and the Red Skull have each set up their own mini-nations that are, like, constantly warring with one another. For the time being, Doc Ock and Red Skull have formed a temporary alliance, so Team Spidey decides to attack them first. Spidey has the Black Cat teleported in because he's not used to leading a team, and he wants at least one member who kind of gets how he operates. However, he teleports her away during a crucial battle with Blade and Morbius, so now she's kind of mad at him because she's worried that he just left her friends to die. However, she chills out upon meeting Captain America, and like, honestly, who wouldn't? They kind of bond due to both having the serum in them, but for a brief second, the show appears to ship them?
I was just wondering how a beautiful young woman like you,
So you see, anything you can do, I can do as well. Or better.
Amazing. can honestly say I've never met a woman like you before.
So, like, you guys remember how during Age of Ultron they tried to make Black Widow and Hulk into a ship, and they had one of the most cringe-inducing scenes I've ever witnessed?
You still think you're the only monster on the team?
You remember how that was, like, absolutely weird, and as soon as the movie was over, the MCU never referenced that pairing again because everyone hated it? This is that scene for me. I mean, I guess I get why they have this bond in this universe, but in the context of the overall, like, Marvel brand. What? Also, can I just say, in this show, Felicia is apparently just always in love with several different people at once, because I thought season 4 implied that she and Morbius were dating now, but here she's flirting with Captain America, and then she kisses Spidey later in the episode, so, like, either they're not together, or she and Morbius have an open relationship, or Felicia is a compulsive cheater. Spidey and the crew defeat the Skull and Doc Ock, and then they go to meet up with the Fantastic Four, who off-screen went on their own to launch an attack on Doom. They discover that the Four have been ambushed and reduced to free because Ben is no longer with them. They head to Doom's kingdom of New Latveria, which is surprisingly idyllic. Of course, that idealism is enforced by Doom and his robots eliminating anything perceived as a threat, but you know. And his science is really impressive too, because he's actually created a watch that allows Ben to switch back and forth between being a normal person and the Thing. This makes Ben consider that possibly Doom has had a change of heart, but this is disproven when it's revealed that Doom was just using Ben so that he could figure out why he was put on this planet, and then when he does, he steals the Beyonder's powers so that he can eliminate everything that isn't New Latveria. However, because Doom is just a mortal, he doesn't have, like, the mental fortitude to control the powers, and when he is asleep, like, monsters start, like, appearing out of his body and attacking the citizens of New Latveria. Spidey and the gang manage to reverse the absorption process, and the Beyonder declares that good is won! He sends everyone but Spidey back home with all their memories erased, and reveals to Spider-Man that the Secret Wars was just a test to see if Spidey was ready for the real challenge. Ooh. So the concept of the Spider-Verse has been really present in Marvel content lately. No Way Home gave us a crossover with the cinematic Spideys, and before that, Into the Spider-Verse introduced audiences to many lesser-known Spider-Man characters like Spider-Gwen and Spider-Ham. The term Spider-Verse was coined in 2014 during the comic storyline called Spider-Verse that brought together nearly every spider-powered individual shown in Marvel media at that point. But guess who had that idea first? Yep. This show created the concept of the Spider-Verse in its last 2 episodes. Say what you will about Spider-Man the Animated Series, but it is never boring. Except for the 6 Forgotten Warriors arc and the Rocket Racer arc, but even those had moments where I was like... So the Beyonder just kind of drops Spider-Man into an alternate reality with no preamble or context, and he's immediately greeted by the pleasant image of a desolated and burnt New York City. Everything's wrong. The Green Goblin and Hobgoblin are like best friends, and he runs into a version of himself who is bonded to the Carnage symbiote and won't stop talking about clones.
You must be obliterated. You see, I really hate clones.
The Beyonder then sees fit to actually explain what the fuck is going on, and he introduces Spidey to 5 other Spider-Men. There's the Iron Spider, who is basically just Tony Stark, a Spidey who never got his 6-arm mutation fixed, a Spidey with Doc Ock's arms, which is unrelated to the Superior Spider-Man comic arc, but is kind of hilarious in retrospect because of it, some guy who says he doesn't even have any powers, but is here in a Spider-Man costume anyway, and the Scarlet Spider, aka Ben Reilly. I told you we were bringing the Clone Saga into this. For those of you unfamiliar, the Clone Saga was a run of Spidey comics from 1994 to 96, in which they revitalized a weird storyline from the 70s where Miles Warren made a clone of Spider-Man that then died in a bomb explosion. 20 years later, somebody decided to write in that the clone survived the explosion and had been living under the fake name Ben Reilly. Ben assumes his own superhero likeness as the Scarlet Spider, and Peter is unnerved. Then for a while they did a twist that Ben was the original and Peter was the clone, but then later Norman Osborn reveals that he masterminded the whole thing and fabricated evidence that Peter was the clone to basically F with them, and then at the end Ben, disintegrates. The Clone Saga is one of the most well-known Spider-Man arcs, not necessarily because it was good, but because everyone has their own hot take about it. There are some people who think it was great, some people who think it killed the Spider-Man franchise, some people who think it started off good but got bad at X, Y, or Z. I personally can't say anything about it because I haven't read it. That synopsis I gave you was regurgitated from Wikipedia. Choosing to include the Clone Saga in your adaptation is risky, because I don't necessarily think that the idea is inherently bad, but there are a lot of ways to make it cringy. It will get your audience's attention, but not all of that will be good attention. I think this show took a good middle route with it, because they implied that they were going to bring it into the main universe by having Miles Warren obtain, the bit of Spidey's DNA, but they also made Ben Reilly be from a different universe, so, if they can test it out, and if the audience hates it, they can drop the plot, never mention it again. Anyway, I should probably explain what Ben's deal is in this show. In his universe, Peter Parker lost not just his parents and Uncle Ben, but also Aunt May, and without her to stabilize him, he, is not in the best emotional state, and that gets worse when he finds out that he has a clone, because he decides that Ben is a nuisance who needs to stay out of his way. Riley changes his name and even dyes his hair blonde as a way to fulfill Peter's request, but just like Peter, he can't have spider powers and just sit back while others suffer, so he adopts the identity of the Scarlet Spider. This, combined with the revelation that Ben might be the original, drives Peter over the edge and he starts trying to kill Riley. Then one day, a portal opens and out falls the Carnage symbiote. By the way, it's kind of implied that this may be the same symbiote as in main Spidey's universe, or it might just be a separate Carnage symbiote, we don't really know. Anyway, it bonds with Peter, and he becomes Spider Carnage, and Carnage's desire for death, combined with Peter's misanthrope nature, means that these two want to kill everything. Using his science prowess, Spider Carnage has figured out a way to combine the TDA with a bomb, and when the bomb explodes, it will destroy not just his universe, but every multiverse. So it's literally gonna blow up everything. Apparently this destruction has already happened once, but the Beyonder managed to roll back time so that Madam Web could go find a bunch of Spider-Men from other universes and put them all, each individually, through training and the Secret Wars to determine which one should lead, and our Spidey was determined to be the best leader, so now he has to lead a spider task force to stop his evil self from blowing up the multiverse. Yeah, I know I just dumped a lot of information on you very quickly. Just know that the show itself doesn't really do better in this regard. Now, some of you may just take umbrage with the idea of Spider Carnage itself. I actually like it, but I can't explain why until we get to the end of this arc. So for right now, just shout out to our boy Christopher Daniel Barnes for having to do 7 different Spider-Man voices for this arc.
I should be in charge of this group. I'm the real Spider-Man.
I don't know what kind of mind game this is, but I'm the real Spider-Man. The real Peter Parker. Guess again. See, Pete, old buddy, we're just as genuine as you are.
It's that clone I told you about. All that matters is the few more hours I need to assemble my ultimate weapon. My device will be ready soon, and then we'll really get what we deserve, all of us.
You may be wondering why the Beyonder and Madam Web can't stop Spider Carnage themselves. Basically, when they are not in their home dimension, their powers are limited because plot. You may also wonder if they're in a time crunch, considering that Spider Carnage wants to blow up the everything, Why spend an absurd amount of time training each of the Spideys and putting them through their own individual secret wars? I don't have an answer for that one totally. Apparently Madam Web believes that Spider Carnage is so far gone that the only thing that can save him is an alternate universe himself. So, but they don't explain why they all had to go through an entire war. I don't know, man. I know the setup for this arc is, like, absolutely bizarre, and, like, you may not be able to get past, like, the basic premise, but if you can, think of how awesome this must have been in the 90s. I mean, I thought it was awesome as a kid. I was like, Spidey's my favorite hero, and now there's 6 of them? Heck yeah. One disappointment, though, is that a lot of the Spider-Men don't have, like, fully developed personalities or interact with each other that much. Like, the powerless Spidey wants to be helpful but has no powers. Ben Reilly is, like, world-weary and depressed, and Mutation Spidey and Doc Ock Spidey get like 4 lines and no personality. I just wish they had kind of fleshed out the other Spider-Men more. It doesn't even need to be drastically, like in Spider-Verse everybody has radically different backstories, but like in No Way Home, all 3 Peters have the same root backstories and kind of similar like behaviors, but they each bring a different energy to the character based on the writing and personality of their movies. And I think Maguire, Garfield, and Holland do a really good job of making them similar but different. The only character who really brings the banter is the Iron Spider, who actually isn't called that in the show, but has been dubbed that by fans because he's literally just Tony Stark.
One of my companies designed security systems like this. You own your own companies? Who do you think built this armored suit? In my world, I'm a multi-billionaire, aren't you?
Seeing him and the other Spider-Men interact is hilarious because they're all used to, like, bad luck and sorrow in their lives, and then the Iron Spider has been blessed/cursed with an unending vault of self-confidence.
I only wish I was able to bring my giant spider robot on this mission with us. Did he say his giant spider robot?
We learn why he's like this when a defeated Spider Carnage leaps to the Iron Spider's world and Madam Web only has enough power to send main Spidey. Side note, do you see what I mean? They eliminate all of the other Spider-Men to only focus on main Spidey and they don't give them chances to interact. But anyway, main Peter quickly observes that the Iron Spider acts like an a-hole because nothing ever went wrong in his life. This universe's Peter Parker is a billionaire, adored by the public and J. Jonah Jameson, and is engaged to a very much alive Gwen Stacy. Also, can I just say that this show gives Gwen more personality in one episode than the entire run of the 60s comics did?
Great, Parker. Here you're engaged to somebody you don't even know. I'm sorry, Miss,
Funny, Peter. The name's Gwen Stacy. Look, Mr. Comedian, I'll go down to let them know you finally arrived. Then you can make your grand entrance.
Like, Sumper replaced her with Felicia because he didn't want to have to introduce a character just to kill her off. And I get that, but I would have loved to see this show's take on Gwen as the main character. Anyway, in this universe, the Kingpin is Peter's lawyer, but now he's evil because Spider Carnage told him that the bomb is actually a mind control device. Spider Carnage goes to the party in his Peter persona, but Gwen notices that he is, in her words, nuttier than a fruitcake, and she finds main Spidey and saves him. But then Spider Carnage kidnaps her and runs off with the bomb, and Spidey realizes that since he has the TDA and can go anywhere in the multiverse, chasing him around isn't going to work here. Peter has to outsmart him. So Spidey pulls the old "if I were him, what would I do" thing, and he realizes he is him. It's a Peter Parker who is turned into a monster, who has been dragged down by his life's tragedies instead of rising above them, but it's still him. And then main Spidey realizes that there is one person in the world who might still be able to get through to Spider Carnage, and this universe they're in might be the only one in which he's still alive. And then this scene happens.
I need to reach the real Peter Parker inside of you. The one who cares about the people around him.
He's gone for good.
Is he? I know he won't talk to me, but I brought along somebody that he might want to talk to.
No, it can't be.
Peter, it's me, Uncle Ben.
Uncle Ben?
I've been told everything.
Is it really you?
I know you've had a very bad time, but in this dimension, I'm here for you. And no matter what, I love you.
I love you too, Uncle Ben. I love you too.
Can we just talk about the undying love that Ben Parker has for his nephew? Like, this Peter has killed and hurt countless people, wants to destroy the entire multiverse, but Ben still believes that deep down there's a good part of him. There's a part of him that's just a sad, scared little boy who's been gifted with awesome power but not the maturity to handle it. And this scene right here, ladies, gents, and people who don't identify as either ladies or gents, is why I love the Spider-Wars arc. If they had just ended with a giant climactic battle with a bunch of explosions, I would have thought this was stupid. But the way that they brought it back around turns this entire, turns this entire arc into a character study of Peter Parker, of how he can make rash decisions when under pressure and when in pain, but even at his absolute worst, he is still capable of this immense love for Uncle Ben and for remorse. Spider-Carnage realizes, the horror of what he has done, and he tries to separate from the Carnage symbiote in one of Chris Barnes' best scenes on the show.
Yes, I must. I see that now.
What's wrong with him?
He's trying to get rid of the symbiote, but it's not giving up without a fight.
Fight it, Peter. Fight it with all your heart and soul. Your real heart and soul.
Too painful. I'm sorry for all the bad things I did. Forgive me. Forgive me.
Unfortunately, in the end, he cannot separate himself from the symbiote, so as penance for his actions, he makes the TDA bomb explode on him instead. One thing I find interesting is that main Spidey seems distraught with the way things have ended, but Ben just says that Spider-Carnage Peter did what he thought was best. You don't often see Ben and Peter diverging in morality, but yeah, since Ben doesn't have a hero complex, he probably wouldn't feel the same guilt Peter would in this situation. Our Peter says goodbye to Uncle Ben in a scene that definitely doesn't make me cry.
You did fine tonight, Peter. I'm proud of you. I'll miss you.
And I'll miss you too, Uncle Ben. But I'll always have you in my heart.
And Peter returns to Madam Web and the others. Web takes Spider-Man to the home of the powerless Spidey, who reveals that he comes from a universe where Spider-Man is a fictional character and he's just an actor who plays him on TV. He takes Spidey to meet the man who created him in this world.
Excuse me. I'm looking for some guy named Stan Lee.
What? Spider-Man? Pam, hold my calls for a while. I think I've finally gone crazy.
Here's the thing, when I was watching this show, we weren't deep into the MCU, so I wasn't desensitized to Stan Lee cameos yet, and this blew my mind. Spidey takes Stan web-slinging, which is so wholesome.
You know, Spidey, I've always wanted to experience real web-slinging.
And I've always wanted to be appreciated as a real hero. It seems you've made me into one. Thanks.
Hey, don't mention it.
And there's this one line right at the end where Peter says,
You know, for so long, I've thought that I never got any breaks. But now, after all I've been through, for once, I like my life. I like myself. And for the first time ever, I wouldn't want to change anything about me.
That moment right there, that character development, so much of the Spider-Man brand is Peter pitying himself, wishing he didn't have his powers, wishing things hadn't gone wrong, wishing etc, etc. So Peter seeing alternate versions of himself and all the ways that things could have gone wrong, that is how you use the Spider-Verse to a thematic end and not just a spectacle one. I mean, Into the Spider-Verse can't really be compared here because it has a different protagonist and therefore different themes, a different story, etc. And No Way Home kinda had this message with Peter learning to be careful what he wishes for, but I honestly feel that out of the three major tellings of the story, this show is best at interweaving it with Peter's own personal struggles and making something come of it. Because something has to come of it. You can't just meet 6 alternate versions of yourself, one who is an inter-multiverse terrorist, and not have it affect you in some deep personal way. In general, I think that is really the show's greatest strength, the way it interweaves Peter's issues with Spider-Man's issues, and even when the show is at its most insane, it still manages to bring everything back to, like, the man and the heart, the love that is behind the Spider-Man mask. Anyway, Madam Web comes to pick up Spidey, and she hilariously leaves Stan Lee abandoned on a rooftop.
Farewell and good luck! Wow, I wonder how I'm supposed to get down from here. I suppose I could wait for the Fantastic Four to drop by and give me a lift.
And for once, Webb decides to do something helpful in her life.
Face front, true believer. We are going to find the real Mary Jane Watson. What? It has been a long, hard journey. And I think you are finally entitled to some happiness.
Amen to that, dear lady. Amen to that.
Boy, I can't wait to find out where Mary Jane is. I sure hope the next season doesn't get cancelled due to executive BS. As is a running theme so far, everyone you ask will tell you a different reason why the show got cancelled. What we do know is that it was the end result of a dispute between Avi Arad and Fox Kids Network head Margaret Lesh. Some will tell you that it was simply due to creative or logistical differences. Some will tell you that Lesh disliked Arad for personal reasons and was waiting for an excuse to cancel the series. Some say that Arad didn't like the direction that Spider-Man TOS was going, so he deliberately antagonized Lesh so the series would be cancelled and he could go make Spider-Man Unlimited. Researching this show has been a lot more of a mess than I expected. Regardless, the series got cancelled, even though John Semper Jr. had a bunch of plans for the 6th season. Good thing he shared them with the internet, and I can regale you of what could have been. First of all, to answer the burning question, where is Mary Jane? She is in 19th century London in a universe where Jack the Ripper has bonded with the Carnage symbiote. Okay, so, like, we've already established that the network wouldn't let you have Cletus Cassidy be a serial killer, so, like, did you think they were going to be chill with a real-life serial killer who specifically did very violent crimes against women? Like, you really think the network's gonna be down with that? Whatever you say, my dude. Sorry, y'all, but I'm going to take this jacket off for this last segment because I'm wearing a long-sleeve shirt and it's warm in here. Season 6 might have also contained an episode with Ghost Rider, which was supposed to be part of Season 4 and/or 5, but didn't end up happening because a rival network was doing a Ghost Rider cartoon. But by the time of Season 6, that Ghost Rider cartoon had ended, so they were able to do what they wanted with him. Mysterio, who I guess survived that explosion from before, gets his hands on the TDA and accidentally runs into Dormammu, and low-key that would be an awesome villain collaboration, and Spidey would have to team up with Ghost Rider to defeat him. It's also been revealed that villains for the season would include the Norman Osborn Green Goblin, who would escape from whatever hell dimension he's in to take back the Goblin title from Harry, and the Rose, which, as I mentioned earlier, is Richard Fisk's villain identity. They planned to include Betty Brant, although for some reason they changed how her last name was spelled, but anyway, she was going to be Robbie's assistant who had a crush on Peter. There was also a draft of an episode written featuring the Puma as a villain. My personal favorite cancelled episode of this show is they were planning to do like a 1-episode mini reboot of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends where they would have Iceman and Firestar come in, and John Semper wanted, if possible, for them to be voiced by their 80s voice actors, Frank Welker and Kathy Garver. And I'm just going to read you a quote from the Spider-Man the Animated Series wiki. if my computer doesn't turn black. Okay, I'm just gonna read you directly from the wiki. According to John Soper Jr., at the end of the episode, after the villain was beat, Spider-Man, Iceman, and Firestar would have all looked at one another and said, "Hey, maybe we should all hang out together and be friends. Wouldn't that be amazing?" Then, after a short silence, they would all shake their heads and go, "Nah," and take off on their own separate ways. That would have been so iconic. Now, this unproduced season sounds quite frankly fantastic and insane and everything the other seasons were, so I definitely would have enjoyed it. And as a kid, I was very annoyed that I never got to find out where Mary Jane was. But also, the final episode of season 5 just works fantastically as a season finale. It's got character development, it's got Stan Lee, and for Pete's sake, it's literally titled Farewell Spider-Man. So I can't say I'm happy the series ended how it did, but that final episode of season 5 does leave me with a sense of contentedness that I don't usually get from finishing serial works. When you're able to, like, look back on it and you don't have to fight off the grief that it's ended and you can just be genuinely happy that you were able to enjoy what you could. The only other media that I've really gotten that emotion from was Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, and then J.K. Rowling decided to make Cursed Child and just ruin everything, so, like, maybe it's better season 6 didn't get produced. Regardless, even if we didn't get to see their reunion, I'm sure MJ made it back to Peter in the end. Seems like she always does.
Good to see you, Pete.
Yeah, you too. Not exactly how I pictured us meeting again, though.
Funny. It's exactly how I pictured it.
She was a girl, he was a nerd. Can I make it any more obvious? She dated Flash, he dated Carbon. What more can I say? He wanted her, she'd never tell. Secretly she wanted him as well. But all of her friends stuck up their nose. Well, little did those jocks all know. He was a Spider-Man, he does what a spider can. But he wasn't good enough for her. Smarts were considered cute, but they got the super suit to save New York and all the earth.
You're pathetic. How did you ever get your reputation?
Must have been the tabloids.